Almost 800 buildings have collapsed in Venezuela, and rescuers are now finding something inside the rubble that is raising a very disturbing question. Was this only geology, or did someone cut corners? The 72-hour survival window has already closed, and what investigators are discovering in the wreckage of these collapsed towers may explain why so many buildings fell exactly the same way. Let us start with where things stand right now. The confirmed death toll has climbed to between 1,430 and 1,450 people. More than 3,150 are injured. But the number that should concern you most is this one. More than 68,000 people remain missing or unaccounted for. Some reports place that number closer to 50,000. Others say 55,000. What is certain is that tens of thousands of people are still unaccounted for. Days after the earthquake struck, almost 800 buildings have collapsed entirely, and the ones still standing are, in many cases, barely holding together. Aerial footage of the hardest-hit areas looks almost indistinguishable from a war zone. Entire blocks reduced to broken concrete and twisted rebar, with survivors and rescue workers moving through streets that used to be residential neighborhoods. The hardest-hit region is La Guaira State, roughly 40 kilometers north of Caracas along the coastline. Dozens, in some cases hundreds, of buildings in that area have collapsed into rubble. Nearly 13,000 people have been displaced from that region alone. Over the weekend, rescue teams managed to pull 33 people out alive, including children. That number, weighed against the tens of thousands still missing, tells you exactly how dire the situation has become. The critical 72-hour rescue window, the period experts consider most crucial for finding survivors, has now passed. According to a Swiss rescue coordination leader, survival probability drops sharply after approximately 3 days. We are now in day 4, and I want to be honest with you about what that timeline actually means, because it matters for understanding everything that follows. The 72-hour mark is not an arbitrary number invented by news outlets to create urgency. It reflects basic human physiology, how long a person trapped without water, in crush injury conditions, in extreme heat or cold, can realistically survive. Search and rescue organizations around the world use this window to allocate resources, deciding how aggressively to continue searching a given site versus shifting personnel to areas where survival odds remain higher. Crossing that threshold does not mean rescue efforts stop. Survivors have been found well beyond 72 hours in past disasters, sometimes after a week or more, particularly in voids created by structural collapse patterns that protect small pockets of space. But the odds shift dramatically, and rescue teams know it. International support has arrived. 24 countries have contributed resources, including nearly 600 tons of supplies. 86 search and rescue dog teams are working through the rubble. More than 2,700 international search and rescue personnel are now supporting roughly 30,000 Venezuelan emergency specialists on the ground. The estimated direct economic damage from this disaster has reached $6.7 billion. And the rescue effort itself keeps getting interrupted. A moderate magnitude 4.7 earthquake struck west of Caracas, and while it was not strong enough to seriously damage buildings that had not already been affected, the ground movement compacted debris from structures that had already collapsed, potentially putting survivors still trapped underneath at even greater risk. When you shake loose rubble, it settles, it compresses. Any air pockets that might be keeping someone alive can disappear in seconds.
Mierda.
That aftershock occurred along a fault zone running parallel to the Venezuelan coastline, part of the same fault system that produced the original double rupture of magnitudes 7.2 and 7.5 within 39 seconds of each other. This tells seismologists something important. Other segments of that same fault system remain under stress, and there is enough accumulated pressure to potentially trigger additional strong earthquakes. Roughly 150 smaller tremors have rattled the region continuously since the main event. Authorities are urging residents to stay alert, avoid entering visibly damaged structures, and follow emergency guidance. Because a building that survived the initial earthquake but is now critically weakened can collapse with the next tremor, however small.
Esto se va a caer.
A similar magnitude event has also occurred further north, near the volcanic island arc of the Lesser Antilles, home to well-documented dangerous volcanoes including Montagne Pelée and Soufriere Hills, both of which have produced devastating eruptions in the past, including one that buried an entire town. These volcanic systems sit within the zone of influence of the original earthquake sequence and could show renewed activity in the coming days or weeks. To put the scale of this earthquake into historical perspective, this is now the second largest earthquake in Venezuelan recorded history, behind only a magnitude 7.7 event in 1900. The third largest was a 7.3 in 2018. This earthquake's first rupture, at magnitude 7.2, ranks fourth. A 7.0 in 1997 rounds out the list. Venezuela has now experienced 2 of its 5 largest earthquakes on record within a single week. Now, let us talk about the construction question, because this is where the story becomes genuinely complicated. Investigators examining the rubble have found something that, on the surface, looks deeply troubling. In footage filmed by rescue workers, you can see them touching and breaking apart material from inside a collapsed building's structural elements, and the material looks porous, almost like styrofoam. If that material had been used inside a load-bearing column, it would explain catastrophic failure immediately. Expanded polystyrene foam has essentially no structural strength. A column built from that material, supporting the weight of a multi-story building, would not survive long under normal conditions, let alone an earthquake. This sparked intense public discussion, but engineers reviewing the same footage have offered an important counterpoint, and it is worth understanding before drawing conclusions. In standard construction practice, when 2 adjacent structures are built close together, a small gap, sometimes just a few centimeters, is deliberately left between them. This allows each structure to move independently during seismic activity or thermal expansion, preventing the buildings from colliding and damaging each other. To fill that gap during construction and keep fresh concrete from shifting, builders often use sheets of expanded polystyrene as what is called lost formwork or an expansion joint. The actual structural weight is carried by steel-reinforced concrete beams on either side, not by the foam itself. When a building collapses, that expansion joint material becomes exposed. To someone without engineering training, it can look exactly like the interior of a structural column. Engineers point out that genuine load-bearing columns contain a dense cage of steel reinforcing bars surrounded by high-strength concrete. In the footage causing the most concern, that steel reinforcement is reportedly absent from the material being examined, which is consistent with it being expansion joint material, not a structural column. If that foam material had actually been the support structure for a building, the structure would not have survived even a single day after construction, let alone years of use. So at this stage, the construction material controversy remains genuinely unresolved. It will likely take investigators weeks or months of work, sorting through the wreckage building by building, to determine definitively what role construction quality played in each individual collapse. This kind of forensic engineering investigation is slow by necessity. After major collapse events elsewhere in the world, structural engineers typically need to extract concrete core samples from surviving sections of a building, test their compressive strength in laboratory conditions, X-ray or physically expose embedded reinforcement to verify it matches approved structural drawings, and cross-reference all of that against the original architectural and engineering plans submitted for permitting. Only after that process can investigators say with confidence whether a specific building failed because of design flaws, material substitution, construction shortcuts, or simply because the shaking exceeded what any reasonable design standard of its era could have withstood. That process is now beginning across hundreds of collapsed sites simultaneously, which is part of why definitive answers will take time. But here is what is not in dispute. The pattern of destruction in certain developments has been catastrophic in a way that raises serious questions regardless of the foam controversy. Take the Hugo Chavez housing complex, home to roughly 7,000 residents. Of the 193 buildings in that development, only 3 remain standing. Experts examining the wreckage have pointed to several possible contributing factors: low-quality construction materials, inadequate construction supervision, and the absence of properly enforced anti-seismic building regulations. This complex was built in 2011, decades after Venezuela's own 1967 earthquake had already demonstrated in devastating detail exactly how this type of construction fails under seismic stress. The lessons were available. The codes had already been written once. What seems to have been missing was enforcement. It is worth understanding what this housing program was originally designed to do, because the context matters. The development was built to relocate thousands of families displaced by severe flooding in 2010 and to provide housing access for low-income residents. These were never intended to be luxury structures, but intention and execution are two very different things. And a building constructed quickly and cheaply to solve an urgent housing crisis still has to meet the basic physical requirement of staying standing during a major earthquake. When 190 out of 193 buildings in a single development collapse, that points to something systemic in how the entire project was engineered and supervised, not simply isolated bad luck in a handful of structures. Now let us step back and look at this from a wider geological perspective, because Venezuela is far from the only country sitting on dangerous fault lines. The difference is in how nations respond to that knowledge over time. Japan sits on one of the most seismically active plate boundaries on Earth, regularly experiencing earthquakes as large as magnitude 9, including subduction megathrust events. Yet Japan typically gets through these events with a small fraction of the casualties seen in disasters like this one. Part of the explanation is geological, but the larger part of the explanation is what Japan chose to do with that geological knowledge. Ground conditions matter enormously in how an earthquake's energy actually affects a city. Seismic waves traveling through solid bedrock pass through relatively quickly, but seismic waves traveling through soft sediment, old riverbeds, ancient lake fill, loosely packed soil that has accumulated in basins and valleys over thousands of years, behave very differently. That soft ground traps the waves, it slows them down, and it can amplify the shaking several times over, while also making it last significantly longer. Parts of Caracas sit directly on exactly this kind of soft basin fill, and it is no coincidence that many of the buildings constructed on that softer ground suffered the most catastrophic damage, while structures on firmer ground in the same general area fared considerably better. There is a striking historical parallel that illustrates this principle clearly. Mexico City is built on the drained bed of Lake Texcoco, a basin of extremely soft waterlogged clay. In 1985, a magnitude 8 earthquake struck the Pacific coast of Mexico, more than 250 kilometers away from the capital. By the time those seismic waves reached Mexico City's ancient lake bed, the soft clay began resonating like a struck drum, oscillating back and forth for minutes at a frequency that matched the natural sway of mid-rise buildings. Approximately 400 buildings collapsed. Tens of thousands of people died. Meanwhile, coastal areas far closer to the actual epicenter suffered comparatively minor damage, simply because of what they were built on. What made the Mexico City disaster especially instructive for engineers worldwide was the specific physics involved. Every building has a natural resonant frequency, essentially the rate at which it wants to sway back and forth if you push it. Tall, flexible skyscrapers sway slowly. Short, stiff structures sway quickly. The soft clay beneath Mexico City happened to oscillate at a frequency that matched mid-rise buildings of roughly 5 to 15 stories almost perfectly. So while very tall buildings and very short buildings in the city survived relatively well, that specific middle band of construction took catastrophic damage because the ground was essentially shaking them at their own natural rhythm, amplifying the motion with every cycle rather than damping it out. Mexico learned from that catastrophe. The country rebuilt its earthquake codes, specifically accounting for ground conditions, and installed the first public earthquake early warning system in the Americas. When a magnitude 7.1 earthquake struck almost directly beneath Mexico City in 2017, far fewer buildings collapsed. The ground had not changed. What had changed was how the city had been built to respond to it. Japan learned a similar lesson nearly a century earlier. After the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, which killed more than 100,000 people, Japan introduced one of the world's first national seismic building codes the following year, and has continued rewriting that code after every major earthquake since, studying precisely how each building failed and systematically closing the gaps. A landmark code revision in 1981 proved its value during the 1995 Kobe earthquake. Buildings constructed after that revision largely remained standing, while older structures collapsed around them. Japanese society now operates on a permanent, deeply embedded assumption that major earthquakes will return. And that assumption itself has become one of the country's most effective forms of defense. That cultural dimension deserves real attention, because building codes alone do not save lives. A code is just a document until it becomes part of how an entire society actually behaves. In Japan, regular earthquake drills are conducted in schools, workplaces, and entire cities from childhood onward. Emergency supply kits are common in households. Building inspections are taken seriously throughout a structure's entire lifespan, not just at the moment of original construction. Insurance markets, banking systems, and real estate valuations all factor in seismic resilience as a basic expectation, which in turn creates ongoing financial pressure for building owners to maintain and upgrade their structures over time, long after the original construction crews have moved on to other projects. Venezuela had the same opportunity to learn and adapt. The country has been struck hard before. In 1812, a massive earthquake destroyed Caracas and killed thousands. At a moment so politically charged, it nearly derailed the independence movement entirely. In 1967, another earthquake struck Caracas directly, collapsing modern apartment blocks in patterns eerily similar to what we are seeing now, demonstrating clearly how the soft sediment underlying parts of the city amplifies destruction. That 1967 disaster did produce new design regulations. The knowledge existed. It had been written down. But a building code only protects people if it continues to be enforced through the long, quiet decades after the disaster that inspired it. And that enforcement appears to be exactly where Venezuela's system broke down. The country has spent nearly 2 decades dealing with economic collapse and hyperinflation. In that environment, developers face brutal financial pressure, spend significantly more to meet expensive seismic codes, or build cheaper and find buyers willing to pay less. Enforcement and retrofitting of older buildings were rarely treated as priorities under those conditions. Much of what collapsed in this earthquake consists of older, unreinforced concrete structures built decades ago during Venezuela's oil boom years, with no significant reinforcement or structural upgrades since. In the hardest-hit coastal areas of La Guaira, entire buildings underwent what engineers call pancake collapse, floors falling directly on top of each other with almost no resistance. This particular failure pattern is one of the deadliest in structural engineering, because unlike a building that topples sideways or leans against a neighboring structure, a pancake collapse compresses every floor into a fraction of its original height almost instantly, leaving extremely few survivable voids for anyone caught inside. It is precisely the failure pattern engineers in earthquake-prone countries spend the most effort trying to design against, because it offers victims essentially no warning and minimal chance of escape. Rescue teams in some of those areas have had to work with hand tools because heavy machinery was unable to reach them in the critical early hours. The Philippines offers another instructive comparison, a nation that sits along the same general danger zone on the Pacific Ring of Fire, crossed by active subduction zones and fault lines. The country has experienced devastating building collapses before. The Ruby Tower collapse in 1968, the 1990 Luzon earthquake that killed more than 1,600 people, and just weeks before the Venezuela earthquake, a magnitude 7.8 struck Mindanao in the Philippines. Buildings swayed, most held. The Philippines does have a national building code with genuine seismic provisions, but the country continues to struggle significantly with enforcement. Substandard materials, construction plans altered after approval to cut costs, structures built without proper structural engineering oversight, and buildings constructed on demonstrably unstable ground. Investigators examining the aftermath of the Mindanao earthquake found that nearly 30% of villages in General Santos City sit on unstable soil. Engineers there have been pleading for years for codes to actually be enforced, not merely written into law. And geologists are clear about one thing. This will not be the last major earthquake to strike any of these regions. The threat does not pause, but human attention does. In areas that do not experience major earthquakes regularly, every few years or more, the danger starts to feel abstract over time. Budget priorities shift elsewhere. Memory fades. This pattern is not unique to Venezuela, the Philippines, or any single country. The Cascadia subduction zone along the Pacific Northwest coast of North America is capable of producing a magnitude 9 or greater earthquake, and historical records indicate it ruptures roughly every 300 to 500 years. British Columbia, Washington State, Oregon, all sit within range of that fault system. And in cities like Vancouver and Victoria, large numbers of older concrete high-rise towers from the 1960s, along with unreinforced masonry buildings, remain standing exactly as they were originally constructed. Because nothing catastrophic has happened there in living memory, the political and financial will to retrofit those structures has consistently lagged behind the known risk. This is sometimes referred to by seismologists as the seismic gap problem, the dangerous psychological space that opens up between when a region last experienced a major earthquake and when geological science says the next one is statistically due. The longer that gap stretches, generation after generation, the harder it becomes to maintain public urgency around a threat that nobody currently alive has personally witnessed. Retrofitting an existing building is expensive and disruptive, often costing more than the original construction. Without a recent catastrophe to point to, that spending is consistently the easiest line item for governments and private owners to delay. 3 different countries, 3 different responses to the same fundamental knowledge. Japan absorbed the lesson of the 1923 Kanto earthquake and built an entire century of policy around the certainty that earthquakes would return. Mexico learned the lesson in a single catastrophic event in 1985 and acted decisively afterward. The Philippines knows the danger clearly and continues struggling to convert that knowledge into consistent enforcement. And Venezuela learned the lesson once, wrote it into law after 1967, and then allowed that knowledge to erode under the weight of decades of economic and political crisis. It is worth asking, honestly, where your own region falls on that spectrum. Most people living near a fault line have never personally experienced the kind of earthquake that would test their local building codes. That is not a comforting fact. It means an enormous number of structures currently standing in seismically active regions around the world have simply never been tested against the conditions they were theoretically designed for. Building codes can look identical on paper between 2 different countries while producing wildly different real-world outcomes, because the gap is rarely in the writing of the regulation. The gap is almost always in inspection, in enforcement, and in the willingness to spend money retrofitting older structures that predate modern standards. The fault lines themselves will never stop moving. What ultimately determines the outcome is what happens during the quiet years in between earthquakes. Whether codes are enforced, whether buildings are reinforced, whether a society chooses to act on the certainty that the ground will move again, or chooses to assume, against all evidence, that it will not. This investigation into exactly what happened inside these collapsed buildings is far from finished. As more evidence emerges from the wreckage, and as engineers reach clearer conclusions about construction quality across the affected developments, updates will follow. If you want to understand the full scientific picture behind why this earthquake was so destructive, that earlier video is linked at the end of this one. Let us also talk briefly about what happens after a disaster like this fades from international headlines, because that phase is often where the real long-term outcome for a country gets decided. In the immediate aftermath, attention is intense. International aid flows in, camera crews and journalists arrive. Politicians visit affected areas and make public commitments. But 6 months later, 12 months later, that attention typically moves on to the next crisis somewhere else in the world. What remains is the actual grinding work of rebuilding, work that depends entirely on whether a government has the institutional capacity, the financial resources, and the political will to follow through long after the cameras have left. Haiti's 2010 earthquake is a sobering example of how this can go wrong. More than a decade later, significant portions of the affected population were still living in inadequate temporary housing, and reconstruction efforts were hampered by many of the same governance and corruption challenges that contributed to the original disaster's severity. Compare that to Japan after the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, where reconstruction, while still ongoing in some coastal communities, proceeded with significantly more institutional coordination, transparent fund allocation, and sustained political attention over many years. Venezuela's reconstruction path will depend heavily on factors well beyond the earthquake itself. The country's existing economic constraints, its access to international financing, and crucially, whether the same systemic enforcement gaps that may have contributed to this disaster get addressed in the rebuilding process, or simply get repeated in the next generation of housing construction. Building back exactly what existed before, without addressing the underlying enforcement failures, would leave the country exposed to a nearly identical outcome the next time a major earthquake strikes the same fault system. And it will strike again. That is not speculation. That is how plate tectonics works. The fault segments that did not rupture during this event remain loaded with stress, and that stress does not disappear. It either releases gradually through smaller earthquakes over time, or it continues accumulating until another major rupture becomes inevitable. The only genuine uncertainty is the timeline, whether that next major event comes in 5 years, 50 years, or somewhere in between. This investigation into exactly what happened inside these collapsed buildings is far from finished. As more evidence emerges from the wreckage, and as engineers reach clearer conclusions about construction quality across the affected developments, updates will follow. If you want to understand the full scientific picture behind why this earthquake was so destructive, that earlier video is linked at the end of this one. Subscribe and turn on notifications because this situation continues to develop and the most important findings from this investigation are still ahead.